You know, niggas gotta get their priorities together. Got their mind on the wrong things, spending their money in the wrong way.
Trapaholics, real trap shit.
Say you need that car with the rims and a charm, just like Jim. It's more than life. Yeah.
I'm telling you. Talk to him.
Say you need that LV bag with the belt and the hat.
That's all you got though.
It's more than life. Yeah.
Talk to him. Real.
Say you wanna turn up at the club, buy some bottles, impress them girls. It's more than life.
Fucking everybody.
Yeah.
Damn, son, where'd you find this?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Saints and Appetizers podcast. And I'm Ethan, and as you can see, we've got the mullet. We got it cleaned up quite a bit, just a little bit. It was getting a little long and out of hand, but you know we're looking like what we did when we first started. So and I'm holding on to this. I said I was going to get rid of it after the one or two podcasts, but honestly, if you've ever had a mustache before, they're just kind of fun, honestly. But I'm back here, and we're gonna have some main course actually for the first time in a while. So we're talking some Saints football and some NFL news stories and things like that. So that's what we're here for. But the first thing I want to do is I want to shout out one of my newer subscribers, because he subscribed a while back, and I think it may have been on a Saints podcast, one of the main courses, and I shouted him out originally on just one of my other podcasts about MMA and UFC. So I think maybe if he was more of a Saints fan than he is a fan of the UFC, I figured I'd give him another shout out. So I just want to shout out Kadro 850. I want to shout you out again. I appreciate you subscribing, and for any other people out there that subscribe, I'll try to give you a shout out, and any bit can help the podcast, from likes, comments, subscribing, any of that. I appreciate it from anyone, and like I said, I'll give you a shout out if I can. All right, but we want to get to some of the main course here, some Saints football talk. There hadn't really been a lot going on around the league or in Saints news, but there's been some funny stuff that's kind of been going on. So some more like social media and Twitter beef and things like that. But anyways, let's get into that right now. And so can I get a menu? And so the first thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about just funny, and I'm not talking about sarcastic funny, like this had me dying laughing, like rolling. Like some people out there may have been offended by the stuff Adam Pac-Man Jones said about the Saints, but it took me a little while to get around to actually watching the video of him like bashing the Saints passing defense and just bashing their whole defense and team just all together, basically. But I was not prepared for the setup for it. That's what had me rolling. And I'm not saying like I laugh because I think it's stupid or anything. I laugh because of the setup for it. So anyways, Pac-Man Jones, he was on Pat McAfee's show, which I've watched several times before, and the Pat McAfee and his regular guys were kind of, I don't know, hyping up the Saints, whether it was sarcastic or genuine or not, but they were hyping them up and saying, oh, you know, they got good players like in Olave and Derek Carr and Michael Thomas, and then they started talking about their defense a little bit, like Mario Davis and Cam Jordan, and they were like, oh yeah, the Saints defense is pretty good. And then just out of nowhere in the corner, Pac-Man Jones is like, yeah, right, the Saints effing suck. And that was just, oh my God, I wasn't prepared for him to start bashing on him like that. That just had me laughing. It had me rolling. This stuff's so funny. I always think that kind of stuff is so funny when you hear some other person like talking good about them, and then just right over their shoulder you hear someone just say something ridiculous to start hating on them. But anyways, once you kind of got into what he was talking about, he said that the Saints corners suck, which we all know that. I mean, they kind of did last year, but part of the reason for that is because you're all pro, first round, stalwart, shut down corner, and Marshawn Lattimore missed more than half the season. So you were dealing with Paulson Adebo, who wasn't playing as good as he was the year before, and then Bradley Roby was hurt for a good portion of the season, and then you got a rookie out there and Alontae Taylor. So I guess he probably wasn't watching them close enough to know about those players, because we know that Marshawn Lattimore is easily a top 10, top 5 corner in the league. I mean, he's been a 3-4 time Pro Bowler. But then he was going on a rant about how many yards they'd been giving up and how they had like the worst pass defense and were giving up like 330 yards a game, which that's just not true. And since then, I think it's come out that he started getting heat on Twitter, and people just telling him how the Saints had were second in passing yards allowed, ninth in points allowed, fifth in total yards allowed, and fifth in red zone defense. So this got back to him, obviously, and he doubled down on it. He doubled down on it, and then he just started going through the games where the Saints gave up quite a few points. He was going through. Let's see. So they gave up 20. This is basically verbatim of what he was talking about. He was just going through so he was like the Saints gave up 28 points against the Vikings. The Saints gave up 32 against the Seahawks. They gave up 30 against Cincinnati. They gave up 42 against the Arizona Cardinals. They gave up 27 against the Baltimore Ravens. So honestly, these were games like in the first half of the season. So honestly, if you look at it from two standpoints, what he's saying really isn't true, because it really is true, because they did kind of suck at the beginning of the season. That they were giving up quite a bit. They were probably averaging giving up like 25 plus points a game. So honestly, that's kind of true. They kind of did suck at the beginning of the season. It really wasn't until like the last 6 games or so where they started actually playing pretty decently. Let's see here. Yeah. So this is like their last 6 games. They only gave up 13 to the San Francisco 49ers. They only gave up 17 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They only gave up 18 against the Falcons. They only gave up 10 against the Cleveland Browns. They only gave up 10 against the Philadelphia Eagles, and they only gave up 10 against the Carolina Panthers. So really, they didn't really turn it on until like the last 6 games of the season. So honestly, what he said is kind of is halfway true, but just the setup of how he said it, how he's just like out of nowhere, out of the over the shoulder of Pat McAfee on the Pat McAfee show. He was just like, the Saints effing suck. Yeah, right. Oh my God, that just was so funny, so funny. Well, you got to take some of these haters as just comedians sometimes, because that was just so funny. The setup for that was just hilarious. But I think the heat from what he said is getting to him, and he's been posting a lot about it lately on Twitter and stuff. But it's just funny, and like I said, it's kind of halfway true. I halfway agree with him, because they weren't good in the first part of the season. But anyways, that's enough of Adam Pac-Man Jones. And also, before I move on from that, I think Pat McAfee show and the guy Pat McAfee and the guys, the regulars on the show, I think they low key don't like the Saints anyways, honestly, because you always kind of hear when they're talking about them, they're kind of sarcastic and stuff. And the reason behind that is I think Pat McAfee is still salty about the Saints beating them in his rookie year, because it was Thomas Morstead's rookie year too, because he kicked the onside kick, the ambush. But I think Pat McAfee's upset about that because the Saints are basically the reason he never won a Super Bowl, and I think he's still salty about that. So that's just the main reason. I think they're always kind of low key, sarcastically kind of hating on the Saints because Pat McAfee just can't get over that. That basically that was his best chance to win a Super Bowl, and he didn't get it, and that's why he doesn't have a ring. And the rookie punter, the other punter for the Saints at that time, Thomas Morstead, does have a ring, and he's actually still playing. But Pat McAfee, he's doing good for himself. He's got one of the most popular podcasts out there, so I think he'll live. But anyways, moving on to the next subject here. Let's see. So this is about the third or fourth time talking about Foster Monroe, but the reason I bring this back up is it goes back to something I was saying about how the Cincinnati Bengals didn't find the cancer, the lymphoma, and that made me think that the Saints must have put him through a more rigorous physical, and that makes me think that they were pretty much gonna sign him. They pretty much did sign him, and then they found that out, and that kind of avoided it. Like they had all you gotta do is pass the physical, and then you're gonna be a Saint, and that didn't happen. And on this report here, let's see, by Pro Football Talk, NBC Sports, it actually says that Foster Monroe found out he has Hodgkin lymphoma through a routine physical after agreeing to a contract with the Saints. So it actually said that he agreed to a contract with them, but he couldn't pass the physical basically because of the cancer. But he says his attitude remains positive, and his doctors like the chances of a complete recovery. And then he just goes on to say how he's got to battle cancer, and that's his main thing, and kind of being positive and throwing out some positive comments about other people that don't know whether they have cancer or fear that they do, and kind of tells them like that they got to go out there and check. You got to go see if you have it, because not whether you see if you have it or you don't doesn't mean you're not going to get it or that you are going to get it. So he just spreads some positive words and information about cancer in general, and he just talks about how he's going to fight cancer just like he's been battling to stay in the NFL and things like that. But yeah, I was pretty sure about that when first reporting this, when this first was reported, that the Saints probably basically did sign him, because the Cincinnati Bengals obviously didn't, because they didn't find the Hodgkin lymphoma, and they didn't actually sign him. So they didn't put him through the same kind of physical that the Saints did to see whether everything is all good, and it just wasn't as rigorous. So he would have been a Saint if he would have got over this, wouldn't have had this. And maybe they talk about how players like Eric Berry and James Conner and players like that have come back in like 6 months to a year. So it's possible he could still end up being a Saint this year. And I really wouldn't understand why he would go to any other team other than Saints, because like I said, it sounds like he signed a contract with them and it just kind of fell through. And I mean, I'm not saying that he owes the Saints anything, but I'm sure he's very appreciative that they found that for him because he is in stage 2, but they say it's slow growing, slow spreading. But yeah, I would be really surprised if once he gets over this and if he's actually back in condition and yeah, back to being the player that he was, if he doesn't end up being the same. All right, and so this is just more. This next subject is just more kind of funny stuff. I didn't watch podcast P show, which I'm guessing that's Paul George's podcast. Playoff P. If you've heard his nicknames before, and basically it was just like I said, I didn't watch the podcast, so some of this may be out of context. I don't really know, but basically Paul George says NBA players have a better chance of playing in the NFL than NFL players playing in the NBA. And I think that's halfway true. I think that goes both ways because obviously there's some NFL players that can play football or NBA players that can play football, and I'm sure there's some NFL players that can play basketball, NBA. And the players that I really think of when I think of players that probably maybe could have played in the NBA, but our basketball players are, the classic ones like Tony Gonzalez, Antonio Gates. Obviously, he's a Saint or was a Saint. Jimmy Graham, like those guys are, those guys wouldn't. They're like big, tall guys in the NFL because they're between 6'4", 6'6", 6'7", 6'8". But I think that's the issue with most NFL players if they were to transition to the NBA is a lot of them don't have that height or size because most of them that do, probably really the only ones that could are basically tight ends because they're still athletic, you know. But most of the players that are, 6'4" and up are big guys, they're linemen, offensive linemen, defensive linemen. That could make it kind of a hard transition because those guys, you don't see too many 300-pound NBA players unless we're talking about Zion Williamson, of course. But other than that, I guess you could say some of those a lot of those guards, because this was something Garrett Wilson, the wide receiver for the New York Jets, actually agreed with Paul George on that, saying obviously NBA players would be able to transition to the NFL or be able to play in the NFL. And I guess he's maybe just looking at that from his position as a wide receiver, a smaller guy, because a lot of guards and point guards and players like that probably could play wide receiver, or even you have players like let's see, who is it? LeBron James, and there was another player that they listed, but definitely LeBron James probably could play because he even did play high school basketball or high school football. But then you bring up names like Kevin Durant and Anthony Davis and probably even Zion Williamson, guys like that. I don't think could play in the NFL, and the reason why is those guys would get broken in half. Those guys are fragile. That's the reason. Like, I'm not saying they don't have the physical talent or ability to do it, but they would probably last like 1 or 2 games and then be out for the season because just playing their sport, they get hurt quite often. But I think LeBron James is kind of a one of one. The dude's a freak, and until a freak athletic athlete, and until like his last couple seasons, now that he's pushing up on 40, he's pretty much been an Iron Man until the last 2 or 3 years. But I can't disagree or completely agree with one way or another with Playoff P's podcast show or podcast P show. But with Paul George, I can't. I don't know if I can agree completely or disagree completely with him. But yeah, I thought that was a funny story because also I see a person, an actual Saints player, clap back at that, and it was Colin Saunders uh, was was like, bro, me and PG trained together last year. He knows the statement is cap, which I'm guessing that means not true, bullshit, or anything like that. Best NFL hoopers could hoop with pros. I've seen it. The best NBA players aren't good in any facet of the game but jump balls. And these are the players that he mentioned: KD, Giannis, AD, Braun. All of them do anything on the field. They might die, and that's what I'm talking about. And I'm not saying, and I picked two of those out that might die, and that's KD and Anthony Davis. But Giannis and LeBron James, I think both those guys are physical freaks and good enough athletes and have been durable enough that they probably could play defensive end or tight end. And talking about, so that's on that. That's the most of the news for that. But also was talking about other players that have been clapping back at these comments that you've heard from Paul George and Adam Pac-Man Jones. I think Tyrann Matthews and Bradley Roby were also getting involved in that conversation about Adam Pac-Man Jones and talking bad about the Saints and especially the secondary. So that makes sense that Tyrann Matthews and Bradley Roby would want to defend themselves with that. So they were posting stats and statistics, and I think Tyrann Matthew mentioned about how at the start of the season, when they were still getting used to each other, Marcus May and all the new safeties and rookies, that yeah, they weren't kind of good. They weren't very good, but towards the end of the season they were. And so there's just some comical stuff going on in the news right now. That this tells you there's a lack of news when this kind of stuff is on the front page. Slow day, you could say. But anyways, I think that's all I have for you. So who dat? And can I get a check, please?